Queen Mary didn't look at jewels the way ordinary people look at jewels. To her, a diamond wasn't simply a diamond. It was lineage. It was leverage. It was memory. It was proof that the monarchy had survived one more death, one more marriage, one more revolution, one more embarrassing relative. She was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck on the 26th of May, 1867, at Kensington Palace, in the same room where Queen Victoria had entered the world 40 years before. And from the beginning, the proximity to royalty was more obvious than its substance. Her parents were chronically, catastrophically in debt. By 1884, the Teck family had fled England for Italy to escape their creditors, and Princess May spent years in Florence, studying what her family could no longer afford to buy. That early education, beauty surrounded by financial ruin, left a mark that never fully lifted. And eventually, when she became queen, she spent 4 decades assembling a jewel collection that wasn't simply a collection. It was her argument that this could never happen again. She collected jewels with the seriousness of a woman collecting evidence. Some were inherited, some were commissioned, some were bought, occasionally at 3 times the probate estimate. Some were given. Some, according to contemporaries, were requested so forcefully that refusal became nearly impossible. That is why Queen Mary's jewels still have reputations. They glitter, they also whisper. And the whisper is always the same. Did she own them? Or did she simply decide they belonged to the crown? There is an official portrait taken in 1935, one of the last formal photographs before King George V died, in which Queen Mary stands fully assembled. The word armored comes to mind, though that undersells the effect. She wears a tiara, she wears ropes of pearls. Across her bodice sits a stomacher, a large articulated jeweled piece that royal courts had used for centuries to announce status, and at her shoulder a brooch, and above the pearls a diamond bandeau, and the entire assembly sits on her body with the weight and density of a declaration. She isn't dressed. She is documented. Contemporary observers reached for the same images repeatedly. The biographer, Anne Edwards, described her public appearances as defined by ornate jewels and fine feathers and opulent furs, the phrase landing with the texture of something half admiring and half uncomfortable. Another story circulated in the same circles. The novelist E.M. Forster, famously short-sighted, attending a wedding at Lord Harwood's house and bowing to the iced and many-tiered wedding cake under the impression it was Queen Mary. The story may be apocryphal. Its survival says something. By the 1920s, the image had calcified into a thing distinct from any individual occasion, layered, immovable, more institutional than personal. This distinguished her sharply from her predecessor, Queen Alexandra, who had also worn extraordinary jewelry in extraordinary quantity. Alexandra wore it with something like joy, a collector's pleasure in accumulated color and sparkle and fashion, the enjoyment of individual beautiful things. Queen Mary wore it differently. Her 1911 coronation crown, which she commissioned from Gerard and paid for entirely from her own funds, contained more than 2,200 diamonds, plus the Koh-i-Noor, plus Cullinan III and Cullinan IV, 2 of the 9 major stones cut from the enormous Cullinan diamond, discovered at the Premier No. 2 mine in South Africa in 1905. She wore the crown at her coronation. Then she signed its ownership over to the royal collection, intending it as the permanent crown for every future queen consort. She wore it once and gave it away to the institution. Queen Camilla wore it again at the coronation of Charles III in 2023. the first time in 3 centuries that a consort had reused an existing crown rather than commissioning a new one. That single gesture contains the whole philosophy. Queen Mary also documented herself with the same obsessive completeness she brought to the collection. She gathered more than 12,000 photographs, arranged them all, and captioned every one in her own hand. The albums are in the royal collection. She wasn't collecting herself, she was archiving the reign. Royal jewelry in the early 20th century operated as a coded system, and Queen Mary spoke it with a fluency that went beyond fashion. The rules were mostly conventional rather than statutory, traditions enforced by expectation rather than law. Tiaras were worn only by married women, their formal debut on the wedding day itself, their subsequent appearances reserved for state occasions after 5 in the evening. A woman who wore a tiara too young, or on the wrong occasion, or without the social sanction that marriage provided, was announcing a claim she hadn't yet earned. A parure, a matched set of tiara, necklace, earrings, and brooch, designed and executed as a unit, communicated something further still. Not just wealth, but dynastic completeness. A parure said, "This isn't assembled from disparate inheritances and lucky purchases. This is whole. This is a claim that has been confirmed from multiple directions simultaneously." Single pieces from broken sets, by contrast, carried a faint undertone of incompleteness, of history only partially preserved, of a family that had kept some, but not all. Stomachers occupied their own register in this system. Wikipedia describes them as jewels preeminently suited to expressing social status, a formulation borrowed from centuries of court practice. A stomacher wasn't supplementary to a formal gown. It was the centerpiece of a bodice, a large, hinged or articulated jeweled construction, worn down the center front, as visible and deliberate as a crest on a shield. When Queen Mary had her 1920 diamond stomacher made from the diamonds of her own wedding gifts, including a crescent brooch presented by the town of Swansea, the conversion was itself a statement. Scattered presents transformed into a unified institutional object. Her biographer, Hugh Roberts, whose 2012 book, The Queen's Diamonds, is the first authorized history of the finest diamond jewelry in the royal collection, specifically attributes the 1920 stomacher to her commission. Scattered sentiment made into permanent form. Pearls in Victorian and Edwardian royal usage carried additional freight. Queen Victoria's 40 years of conspicuous widowhood after Prince Albert's death in 1861 had entangled white stones with grief, with royal endurance, with a long aftermath of loss. Colored stones said different things. Emeralds were history, specific, family-connected, traceable. Diamonds were permanence and light, the material that survived everything, the one that could be worn at any occasion without apology. And the scale of a piece announced the occasion. A small brooch was private, a parure was state. A stomacher was the formal assertion of a complete claim in a room full of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. Queen Mary wore this system so fluently that her body in formal photographs functioned as a visible ledger, an account of what the monarchy had accumulated, what it had kept, and what it intended to pass forward. Scholars of royal wills have observed that jewels designated as heirlooms of the crown were, in the language of those documents, not personal jewels, but institutional objects, temporarily held by the woman who wore them, permanently belonging to the structure itself. This distinction was never formally codified in law. It was maintained by convention, by expectation, and, during Queen Mary's time, by her own formidable personal authority. To understand why this mattered to her so viscerally, you have to understand where she came from. Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, May to the family, was born the daughter of two royals who were, by any financial measure, a disaster dressed in good clothes. Her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, was royal by title and morganatic by origin. His paternal grandfather had contracted a morganatic marriage to Countess Claudine Rede von Kies-Rede, a match that removed his descendants from the Württemberg succession entirely. Francis, therefore, carried the lesser style of Serene Highness, had no inheritance, no estate, no income of substance. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of King George III, which provided impeccable ancestry and almost nothing else that was practically useful. Her relationship with money, as one historian characterized it, could only be described as optimistic to the point of danger. The parliamentary annuity she received, approximately £5,000 a year, was no match for the velocity of the family's spending. By 1884, the mathematics caught up with them. The Teck family fled England for Florence to escape their creditors. This wasn't a continental adventure. It was a public humiliation wearing the costume of a grand tour. Princess May was 17. She spent years in Italy studying art, architecture, and the objects that old money had accumulated over centuries. All of it in the context of a family whose own claims had proven embarrassingly fragile. The ABC Australia described the formative lesson with precision. The sad example of her parents' near bankruptcy taught Princess May a salutary lesson. Beautiful things could vanish if you didn't hold on to them correctly. The family's place in the extended network of European royal houses was tenuous despite the connections. When they returned to England and Queen Victoria began looking for a suitable bride for her grandson, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, third in line to the throne, Princess May was selected with careful intent. Victoria saw something in her: intelligence, gravity, the bearing of someone who understood exactly how much she had to prove. The engagement was announced in 1891. 6 weeks later, Prince Albert Victor died of influenza, aged 28. May was briefly a fiancée without a fiancé, a royal connection suspended between two reigns. A year later, she agreed to marry his younger brother, Prince George, Duke of York, the man who would become King George V. The wedding took place at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace, on the 6th of July, 1893. The Pope Hennessy biography, drawing on the royal archives and on the recollections of her surviving circle, captures the weight of it. This wasn't simply a grand occasion. It would settle everything: position, income, standing, purpose. May of Teck, who had grown up watching her parents hide silver from creditors, became the future Queen of Great Britain. Everything she acquired afterward would carry the weight of that transformation. Vanity Fair's 2021 investigation of her collecting practices quotes a letter she wrote to a fellow collector in 1914 after showing her rooms at Buckingham Palace. "It was such a pleasure showing you my rooms on Sunday, as you are so very appreciative of detail and worthy of all the beautiful objects which are ever a constant joy to me. It always seems strange to me that there can be people to whom these things mean and say nothing to them. I confess I pity them, as they miss much in life." She called collecting my one great hobby, but it was a hobby built on architectural anxiety. As early as 1909, she wrote to her Aunt Augusta, "I am very busy now seeing that our various inventories are correct, and that everything is entered as far as possible with its history. It's really rather wonderful what we have managed to collect and get together since we married. Quite a creditable collection of family things, without spending much money over it. I confess I feel rather proud of our endeavors. I hope you won't laugh at me." This isn't the letter of a woman requesting reassurance. It's the letter of a woman reporting to a record she intended to survive her. James Pope Hennessy, commissioned in 1955 to write the official biography with unrestricted access to the royal archives, described her potent interest in family history as a guiding factor in later years when, as Queen Mary, she was constantly adding to the royal collection pictures and objects of family interest bought out of her own private purse. He traced the drive back to her mother, who had never forgotten she was a granddaughter of King George III, and forward through everything Queen Mary subsequently did. His research notes, published in 2018 under the title The Quest for Queen Mary, edited by Hugo Vickers, describe her acquisitions as compulsive purchases and acquisitions of items of uncertain monetary value, rather than thefts. The distinction is important, and Pope Hennessy was careful about it. Lord Claude Hamilton, one of the people Pope Hennessy interviewed for the biography, offered the most vivid characterization on record. She bought family things chiefly, and up to the end would insist on, e.g., saddling the Duke of Gloucester with a vast and impossible silver tea urn because it had belonged to the Duke of Cumberland. The Duke of Gloucester was her third son, Henry. The Duke of Cumberland was a royal uncle from the previous century. The logic connecting the two men, that the tea urn had once stood in a Cumberland household and therefore must return to Windsor custody regardless of its size, its impracticality, or whether Henry had anywhere to put it, was pure Queen Mary. Historical ownership overrode all other considerations. Her method was procedural and methodical. She maintained extensive knowledge of the royal collection's documented history, working through old inventories to identify pieces that had drifted into other hands through gifts, sales, loans, and the informal dispersals of previous decades. Having identified them, she wrote letters to the current holders requesting their return. This wasn't a demand in any legal sense, but it was a request from the Queen, and the social architecture around such requests made them difficult to decline. The aristocratic grapevine learned quickly. Families reportedly concealed their finest possessions before royal visits, anticipating her interest in anything with a discernible royal connection. One anecdote, preserved in Piers Brendan and Philip Whitehead's Windsor Dynasty History, and recounted by Anne Edwards, describes Queen Mary taking tea one afternoon with an elderly Lady Hudson. Queen Mary admired a set of chairs painted by Angelica Kauffman. She noted that they would go splendidly with a Kauffman table she owned. Lady Hudson smiled but offered nothing. The clock ticked. The sun went down. Queen Mary continued sipping her tea. By 9 in the evening, Lady Hudson had held out as long as she could, and the chairs went off in the royal Daimler. This is a third-hand anecdote, not a documented transfer, but the fact that it circulated, and that similar stories accumulated around dozens of royal visits, built a reputation that the biographers all had to address. What they agreed on, uniformly, was that she wasn't a kleptomaniac. She didn't carry a handbag on royal visits. There was nowhere to conceal anything. The Spectator, reviewing the literature, settled on stiff and cold, but no kleptomaniac. Anne Edwards, who had no particular reason to be charitable, called her acquisitive from her impecunious youth up. The Apollo magazine observed that she held joint sway over the entirety of the royal collection, then, as now, one of the largest surviving private collections in the world. Hugo Vickers, editor of The Quest for Queen Mary, was measured and precise. She had a good eye, and she did fabulous work in identifying and marking provenance, also of bringing the right collections together. She presented more than 300 objects to the Victoria and Albert Museum. She improved and extended the documentation of everything she touched. She was building something that was meant to last beyond her. The jewels themselves demand their full stories, because the stories are where the philosophy becomes visible. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Tiara was commissioned in 1893 from Gerard by Lady Eva Greville, who organized a fundraising subscription across the women's clubs of Great Britain and the British Empire as a wedding gift for Princess May. E. Wolf & Co. made the piece, a festoon and fleur-de-lis diamond tiara in silver and gold, originally topped with 14 Baroque pearls, designed to be transformable between a full tiara and a smaller coronet. The fundraising was more successful than anticipated. A surplus of £3,000 remained after the tiara was purchased, and Queen Mary directed the surplus toward the widows and children of the sailors lost that same year when HMS Victoria sank after a collision during naval exercises in June 1893. 358 men dead in the Mediterranean. The surplus from a tiara fund became a maritime charity. That detail says something about how she understood the obligations that came with beautiful things. In 1914, she returned the tiara to Gerard and had the Baroque pearls replaced with diamonds from another piece, the County of Surrey tiara, which she had received on marriage. The pearls weren't discarded. They were transferred to a new piece, the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, made by E. Wolf & Co. for Gerard in either 1913 or 1914, designed as a deliberate recreation of a tiara owned by Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge. The Cambridge Lover's Knot was constructed from materials already in Queen Mary's family possession, the transferred pearls plus family diamonds, and its design reached back a generation into her mother's family. She wasn't simply accumulating new objects. She was reconstructing the visual record of a dynasty that had already existed before her. The Girls of Great Britain tiara passed to Princess Elizabeth in 1947, given by her grandmother as a gift on the occasion of her engagement to Prince Philip. Elizabeth wore it first publicly in 1948 on a trip to Paris. For her official accession portraits in February 1952, taken by photographer Dorothy Wilding at Buckingham Palace, she wore this tiara rather than a formal crown. From those images, reproduced on stamps and coins and banknotes across the Commonwealth and Empire, the diamond festoon and fleur-de-lis became the standard image of her face for 70 years. Roger Wivington's 1990 design for the Bank of England's £5 note used a version of it. A descendant of that image appeared on all Bank of England notes until Elizabeth II's death in September 2022. Elizabeth called it Granny's tiara. The piece started as a fundraising gesture. It ended as the most reproduced image of a monarch in the history of British currency. The Vladimir tiara arrived from a direction Queen Mary couldn't have anticipated. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, known at the Russian court as Grand Duchess Vladimir, wife of the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, was by all accounts one of the most formidable women in St. Petersburg, described as the grandest of Grand Duchesses and known for a collection of jewels that rivaled anything in the imperial family. The court jewelers Bolin made her tiara in either 1874 or 1875. Sources vary by a year. 15 interlocking diamond circles, each fitted with a drop-shaped pearl pendant, the whole construction large enough to read across a ballroom. She wore it at the highest occasions of the Russian imperial court for 4 decades. When Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917 and the Bolsheviks consolidated power across the following months, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna's world collapsed. She was in the Caucasus when her jewels were still locked in the safe at the Vladimir Palace in Petrograd. Retrieving them required a British intermediary, Albert Stopford, an antiques and art dealer who specialized in Fabergé and Cartier and had long-standing social connections in both Russia and England. In September 1917, Stopford retrieved 224 jewels from the Grand Duchess's safe, carrying them out of Russia in a diplomatic bag. The Vladimir tiara was among his haul. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna escaped and died in exile in France in 1920. The following year, her daughter, Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna, needing to support herself and other surviving members of the family, sold the tiara. The Royal Collection Trust confirms that Queen Mary purchased it in 1921. The tiara had been damaged in transit. It had not survived its journey from a palace safe to a diplomat's bag to England entirely intact, and Queen Mary had Gerard repair it. 3 years later, in 1924, she returned it to Gerard for further work. The pearl drops made interchangeable with a set of her own emeralds. Those emeralds required their own explanation, because they arrived through a family crisis that had been barely avoided. The Cambridge emeralds had been won in a lottery. In the early 19th century, Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, Queen Mary's maternal great-grandmother, bought raffle tickets for a state-sponsored charity lottery in Frankfurt while visiting her native Hesse. She won a small box containing approximately 40 cabochon emeralds of various sizes, deep green and cut in the old round style. The stones became known, logically, as the Cambridge emeralds. Princess Augusta had them set into a necklace with 5 pendants and a pair of drop earrings. When she died in 1889, they passed to her daughter Princess Mary Adelaide, Queen Mary's mother, who kept the set intact but set 2 loose emeralds into her own diamond stomacher, which Gerard had previously made for her, one at the center, one hanging as a pendant from the bottom. When Princess Mary Adelaide died unexpectedly in 1897, the emeralds didn't go to her most dynastically prominent child, Princess May, by then Duchess of York, but to her third child, Prince Francis of Teck. Frank was a bachelor with no wife to wear the stones. He had instead a mistress, Eleanor Constance, the Countess of Kilmorey, known as Nellie. When Frank died suddenly in 1910, at 40, he had made his arrangements. His will bequeathed the Cambridge emeralds entirely to Nellie Kilmorey. The will was sealed immediately, a practice that Queen Mary herself requested through legal channels, and one that continues in the British royal family to this day. That sealed will was finally unsealed in 2024, more than a century later, confirming what family accounts had long maintained. The court jeweler, one of the authoritative specialist sources on royal jewelry history, describes Queen Mary's reaction with deliberate understatement. She wasn't particularly happy about the fate of their grandmother's emeralds. She engaged her brothers, Adolphus and Alexander, who were also the executors of Frank's estate, and approached Nellie Kilmorey directly. The Royal Watcher records the figure, £10,000, paid by Queen Mary to acquire the Cambridge emeralds, almost 3 times the probate estimate. One separate brooch, which Frank had received as a gift from his godfather, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, was, according to one account, left with Nellie for her lifetime on the condition it would eventually return. Once the emeralds were back in her hands, Queen Mary moved immediately. For the Delhi Durbar of 1911, the great coronation celebration held in India, where King George V and Queen Mary were presented to the subcontinent as Emperor and Empress, she commissioned Gerard to create a full parure, merging the Cambridge stones with some of the largest diamonds in the royal vaults. The Delhi Durbar parure comprised a tiara, necklace, stomacher, earrings, and bracelet. 10 pear-shaped Cambridge emeralds were mounted atop the tiara. 9 went into the necklace, alongside the Cullinan 7 diamond and 6 large diamonds. 7 into the stomacher, 2 into the earrings. The court jeweler observed that the parure combined Queen Mary's own family's emeralds with the grandest institutional diamonds, the Cullinan stones, in a single suite of jewels. Nothing says rightful queen consort quite like merging your own inheritance with the institution's greatest treasures. A few years later, she removed the 10 pear-shaped emeralds from the top of the Delhi Durbar tiara and moved them to a smaller diamond bandeau. Then, in 1924, she adapted the Vladimir tiara. Gerard fitted 15 Cambridge emeralds as interchangeable drops, 10 from the bandeau plus 5 more, replacing the original pearls. The Vladimir tiara can now be worn 3 ways, with the pearl drops, with the emerald drops, or stripped of both, the 15 interlocking diamond circles stark and architectural on their own. Each version reads differently. The pearl version is classical, almost mourning in tone. The emerald version is emphatic. The Cambridge family's lottery winnings, nearly lost to a bachelor's love affair, now hanging from a Russian imperial frame that had been smuggled out of a palace safe by a British art dealer and purchased from a dynasty in exile. The bare circles are something else entirely. The structure revealed. History without ornament. The Cullinan 3 and 4 brooch tells the story of a gift rather than a negotiation, and a nickname that has outlasted the giver by more than 70 years. The Cullinan diamond was found on the 26th of January, 1905, by Frederick Wells, superintendent of the Premier No. 2 mine near Cullinan, South Africa, who spotted the enormous crystal embedded in the mine wall during his rounds. It weighed 3,106 carats, the largest gem-quality diamond ever discovered. Presented to King Edward VII in November 1907, it was sent to the Asher Diamond Company in Amsterdam for cutting. After an 8-month process, 9 major diamonds were produced. 2 of the smaller major stones, Cullinan 3, a pear-shaped diamond of 94.4 carats, and Cullinan 4, a cushion-cut diamond of 63.6 carats, were purchased from the Ashers by the South African government and presented to Queen Mary in 1910, as a gift marking the accession of King George V. She had Carrington set them in a platinum brooch a year later. Cullinan 4th at the top, Cullinan 3 hanging below as the pear-shaped drop. For the 1911 coronation, she also set both stones temporarily into her own crown, the pear-shaped Cullinan 3 on the top cross, the cushion-cut 4th in the center of the base, before removing them afterward and returning them to the brooch. After her death in 1953, the brooch passed to Queen Elizabeth II, who wore it on a state visit to the Netherlands in 1958 and arranged to visit the Asher workshop in Amsterdam, the craftsman who had cut the original stone 50 years before. Louis Asher, who had personally overseen the cutting process in 1908, was present, elderly by then. Elizabeth II removed the brooch so that he could examine it more closely. He wept. She called the brooch Granny's Chips, the domestic diminutive applied to 2 diamonds totaling 158 carats, as though the scale could be made manageable by the warmth of the word Granny. The nickname has attached itself permanently, which is itself a small piece of evidence. Even at this scale, the dynastic feeling survives in the familiar. The Cambridge sapphire parure tells the story of what a gift from Queen Mary actually signified. Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, the same woman who won the Frankfurt lottery, also owned a sapphire set. Fringe necklace, corsage brooch, 2 smaller brooches, ring, and bracelet. The pieces passed to her daughter Princess Mary Adelaide, and from Mary Adelaide to Queen Mary. When Prince George, Duke of Kent, Queen Mary's 4th son, married Princess Marina of Greece at Westminster Abbey in November 1934, Queen Mary gave the entire Cambridge sapphire parure to Marina as a wedding gift. The provenance chain, Princess Augusta to Princess Mary Adelaide to Queen Mary to Princess Marina, stretched 4 generations and over a century. The gift communicated something that no formal statement could convey. You are joining a family that keeps things. The sapphires sitting around Marina's neck at her wedding had been set and worn and passed forward by women going back to the early 1800s. Now they were in Marina's custody, or, in Queen Mary's understanding, they were in Marina's custody, which wasn't quite the same as ownership. What happened afterward is instructive. The Kent family eventually sold the original tiara from the Cambridge sapphire set and commissioned a replacement, using diamonds and sapphires from the original pieces. This is what happens to royal jewels when the woman who enforced the institutional logic is gone and financial reality reasserts itself. The system doesn't survive automatically. Someone has to maintain it. In 1953, Queen Mary's will bequeathed an additional sapphire and diamond bar brooch to Princess Marina, the last material expression of a friendship that had been maintained in part through 4 decades of gifts, expectations, and the particular intimacy of shared gems. The most fraught jewel story in Queen Mary's life unfolded in December 1936, when Edward VIII chose Wallis Simpson over the throne. Queen Mary didn't attend the abdication signing. She had been aware for months of the trajectory. Her letter to her eldest son about his decision to abdicate survives. The Duke of Windsor confirmed its existence to the New York Times in October 1959, noting that he had given it to Pope Hennessy for the biography. Its full contents have never been published. The tone can be inferred from everything that followed. Before and after the abdication, Edward gave Wallis Simpson significant jewelry. In 1936, a Van Cleef & Arpels ruby bracelet inscribed, "Hold Tight." A Cartier cross-charm bracelet assembled between 1934 and 1944. A Cartier emerald necklace in 1949. Her collection was described by contemporaries as the envy of women on both sides of the Atlantic. Whether any of the pieces he gave her had originated from royal reserves rather than his personal funds is contested and, given the state of the surviving record, probably unresolvable. Reports circulated after the abdication that a royal vault inventory conducted in early 1937 had revealed discrepancies, missing pieces, some replaced with inferior stones. These reports can't be confirmed from named primary sources and should be held accordingly. What can be stated plainly is Queen Mary's response to everything the abdication represented. She refused to receive Wallis Simpson, absolutely and permanently. Every indirect approach was declined. She wrote letters that were specific enough about the constitutional implications that her son preserved them for his official biographer. And when she died in March 1953, she left the Duke of Windsor, her eldest child, the former King of England, 3 small boxes and a pair of silver candlesticks. After a lifetime spent assembling one of the most significant jewel collections in history, that isn't an accident of inventory. That is a verdict, rendered in objects, in the language she had always spoken most fluently. When Queen Mary died on the 24th of March, 1953, of lung cancer at Marlborough House, aged 85, approximately 10 weeks before her granddaughter's coronation on the 2nd of June, the dispersal of her jewels followed the same logic that had governed their acquisition. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara had already gone to Princess Elizabeth in 1947. The Cullinan 3 and 4 brooch passed to Queen Elizabeth II. The Cambridge emeralds and the Vladimir tiara went to the Queen. The fringe tiara, a wedding gift from Queen Victoria that Queen Mary had converted from necklace to Kokoshnik-style tiara by Gerard in 1919, had gone to the Queen Mother in 1937, who loaned it to Princess Elizabeth for her wedding in November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. After Queen Mary's death, it passed permanently to Elizabeth II. The Delhi Durbar tiara went to the Queen Mother. A sapphire and diamond bar brooch went to Princess Marina. According to Tatler, the majority of Queen Mary's jewels transferred to Queen Elizabeth II following the 1953 coronation. Elizabeth II wore them for another 7 decades. The Girls of Great Britain tiara appeared so frequently for so many official portraits and state occasions that it became, through repetition, the most recognized image of a sovereign in modern British history, appearing on banknotes and coins and stamps across the Commonwealth until the Queen's death in 2022. Elizabeth wore the Cullinan 3 and 4 at the Diamond Jubilee service at St. Paul's Cathedral in June 2012. The Cambridge emeralds hung from the Vladimir drops at state banquets in Dublin, in Berlin, in Paris, in Canberra for 50 years. In 1988, Elizabeth had the Vladimir tiara sent back to Gerard again for frame repairs, continuing the maintenance that Queen Mary had begun in 1921, passing the custodial responsibility forward through time. In 2023, Queen Camilla wore Queen Mary's 1911 coronation crown at the coronation of Charles III, the first reuse of a consort's crown in 3 centuries. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara illustrates the argument more cleanly than almost any other piece. Queen Mary had it made in 1913 or 1914, based on a tiara belonging to Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, using pearls and diamonds already in her family's possession. She wore it. Elizabeth II inherited it and loaned it to Diana, Princess of Wales, who wore it to dozens of formal engagements through the 1980s and became, for a generation, the face most associated with it. After Diana's death in 1997, the tiara returned to the royal collection. Catherine, Princess of Wales, now wears it. The piece is over a century old. It has had 4 wearers across 4 generations. It was made from materials that were already old when Queen Mary assembled them, set into a design that deliberately referenced her grandmother's tiara, currently in active use by a woman who wasn't yet born when Diana first wore it. There is a philosophical question underneath all of this that the evidence answers only indirectly. No surviving letter, diary entry, or documented statement contains Queen Mary in her own words declaring that royal jewels belong to the crown rather than their individual wearers. That philosophy is present in everything she did. The methodical retrieval through old inventories. The payment of £10,000 for the Cambridge emeralds, 3 times their probate estimate. The signing of her coronation crown to the royal collection after wearing it once. The gift of complete parures to daughters-in-law at the moment they entered the family. The 3 small boxes and a pair of silver candlesticks left to the son who had, in her view, treated the institution as something he could simply resign from. The inference is solid and consistent, but it's inferred from actions, not quoted from statements, and this seems like the right place to say so, because the distinction matters when the subject is a woman who has been called both a curator and a thief, sometimes by the same writers, sometimes in the same paragraph. What she actually was is more interesting than either accusation. She was someone who had grown up without the foundations that most of her relatives took for granted: money, position, uncomplicated legitimacy, and who responded to that fragility by building something that couldn't easily be taken. The royal collection, expanded and documented under her supervision, wasn't personal property in the ordinary sense. It was an argument made in objects. The monarchy sang, in the language of diamonds and emeralds and sapphires and provenance chains stretching back to a Frankfurt charity lottery in the early 19th century. We know what we have. We know where it came from. We intend to keep it. James Pope Hennessy, writing with access to the archives and the people who had known her, described this drive as one that became a guiding factor in later years. The same engine that had powered her mother's pride in being a granddaughter of King George III, now redirected by a woman who had learned in Florence what happened when beautiful things weren't properly secured. The difference between the Duchess of Teck fleeing creditors and the Queen who paid above-market prices to retrieve her grandmother's emeralds isn't a difference in the underlying impulse. It's a difference in position and method. The impulse that beautiful things belonging to a dynasty should stay with that dynasty, that dispersal was a kind of institutional failure, was exactly the same. The stones she gathered still glitter because they were made to survive the women who wore them. That was the point. A daughter-in-law could die. A son could abdicate. A queen could be widowed at 50 or at 70. A dynasty could tremble on a December afternoon when a king signs a document in a country house and walks out into the cold. But the Cambridge emeralds, once won in a Frankfurt lottery and nearly lost to a bachelor's love affair, would remain. Reset in the Vladimir drops, hanging from 15 interlocking diamond circles on a frame smuggled out of a palace safe by a British art dealer, worn at a state banquet in Dublin in 2011 by a queen who had inherited them from the woman who paid 3 times their value to bring them home. Granny's tiara would remain, on coins, on stamps, on the face of 5 decades of banknotes, the diamond festoon and fleur-de-lis that Queen Mary had modified in 1914, becoming the most reproduced image of a monarch in the history of the institution. Granny's chips would remain, returning to Amsterdam so that an old man who had cut the original stone could hold the brooch in his hands and weep, while a queen called it by its family name and watched. Queen Mary understood all of this before most of the pieces existed in their final form. She built the system through decades of methodical acquisition, careful documentation, deliberate gifting, and the fierce conviction that royal objects belonged to the institution even when they sat in a drawer at Marlborough House. Her jewels weren't decoration. They were possession made visible. Every brooch and tiara and stomacher was the monarchy saying again and again, "We keep what matters." That was the point. And the stones are still here. If you want more stories like this, subscribe.